February 1878, just outside Bismarck, Dakota Territory. The kind of morning where the world looks clean because it's been scrubbed raw snow packed hard as flour air sharp enough to bite the inside of your nose. When you exhale, it doesn't drift. It snaps into crystals and falls. On that morning, a trunk hit the snow with a sound like a coffin lid. Kathleen Brennan had been 16 for less than a week. She didn't have a coat that fit her right. The boots were a hand-me-down pair that pinched at the toes and let wind creep in around the ankles. Her stepfather stood in the doorway like a nailed-up sign. One finger pointed at the white horizon as if the land itself had called her name. Inside the house, her mother watched from a window and made her face into stone. Not anger, not pity. Something worse silence you can't argue with. Kathleen didn't plead. She didn't have the luxury. Frontier pride wasn't a sermon to her. It was just the only thing you could keep when everything else got taken. She dragged the trunk until her hands began to lose feeling and her wrists started burning from the rope. The snow wasn't soft. It was crusted, wind-packed, and it fought every step like it had opinions. In the trunk, 2 dresses, a wool blanket with a patch in the corner, her father's old hammer heavy in a way that felt honest, and a few coins wrapped in cloth. Not even $5. The kind of money that looks like safety until you do the arithmetic. Kathleen did the arithmetic. Town lots around Bismarck were being spoken of like gold $25 and up, if you could even find a seller who wasn't waiting to squeeze you. Boarding houses wanted their weekly fee whether you were warm or not. And if you paid to sleep indoors, you'd wake up poorer every morning until you woke up with nothing. So she didn't spend, she counted. $4, a job maybe, a meal if she was lucky, and a winter that still had teeth. She walked toward town because standing still in Dakota in February is how you learn what the cold thinks of you. By noon, she'd found work where steam rose from dishwater and grease clung to everything like a second skin, the Northern Pacific Dining Hall. 35 cents a day and a meal. Not good, not terrible. A rope thrown down into deep water. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Halterman, a widow with hands that moved like she'd been doing hard work since the day she learned to walk, looked Kathleen over and didn't ask the question that everyone wanted to ask. She just said, "Can you keep up?" Kathleen nodded. For 2 weeks, Mrs. Halterman let her sleep in the storeroom on empty flour sacks. Not comfort, just not death. You could hear the building creak at night as the temperature dropped, hear the stove groan and the wind throw itself against the siding. Kathleen lay there staring at the dark, listening to other girls breathe in their beds upstairs, and tried not to think about the way a life can be broken by one accusation. People in town talked. They always did. Someone had said she'd been seen behind the stable with a railroad worker. She hadn't. But in places like this, truth didn't win arguments. Confidence did. And her stepfather had plenty of it. Kathleen learned early that winter doesn't care why you're alone. It only cares that you are. So, in those 2 weeks, she did what she'd learned to do from the one person who had never wasted words. Her real father, Michael Brennan, had been a builder in the way poor men are builders. Not fancy, not proud, just capable. Chicken coops, lean-tos, repairs that kept the wind from getting inside. He'd taught her small things that mattered: how grain runs in a board, how water always follows its own plans, how the ground is not solid just because you're standing on it. When he died a few years earlier, the lesson stayed. Like warmth you can't see, but you can still feel. Kathleen started looking for land the way a mechanic listens to an engine-quiet patient and suspicious of anything that looked easy. West of town along Apple Creek, the spring floods had carved a steep bank, 9 feet tall, in places a natural wall with a south-facing slope that drank sunlight even in cold months. Cottonwood stood above like thin sentries, bark split and weathered. The creek ran under ice, but you could hear it if you knelt close, moving alive, refusing to freeze completely. On a Sunday, Kathleen walked out there. No church bonnet, no company, just her boots crunching over crusted snow, and her breath leaving a faint fog that the wind tore away. She stood at the base of the bank and looked. A frame house needed lumber. Lumber needed money. Money needed time. And time in Dakota was always borrowed. But a bank like this, a hillside, it was already half a shelter. A dugout. Not a neat one. Not a romantic one. A hard earthen room cut into the ground with a roof you could stand on. The kind of shelter men built when they first arrived and didn't yet have boards for walls. The kind the town laughed about afterward like being poor was a joke that ended when you got rich. Kathleen didn't laugh. She pictured the shape. 8 feet back into the slope, 10 feet wide if she kept it modest, with a front wall built up where the bank opened. A roof made from cottonwood poles and sod cut from the prairie, 2 layers seams crossed heavy enough to stay alive enough to knit together. A door, a small window if she could find glass. Nails because nails were the only part you couldn't carve out of the earth. If she did it right, she could build it for under $10. And here's the first thing that separates people who live through winters from people who merely experience them. Kathleen wasn't thinking about March. She was thinking about the next February. Because in Dakota, spring is mercy. Winter is the judge. She started digging on March 3rd. The top layer of ground was still frozen like stone, 6 inches of stubborn refusal. So she used the oldest trick in cold earth fire. She built a small fire on one section until the soil softened, dug while it was workable, then moved the fire again. Thaw, dig, thaw, dig. Her hands blistered, split, and healed wrong. Her shoulders stayed sore. She worked before her shift, after her shift, and on Sundays when everyone else rested their bones and convinced themselves they deserved it. 4 hours of sleep some nights, sometimes less, Mrs. Halterman noticed. You can't hide a person's hands from someone who has lived by hands her whole life. What in God's name are you doing? She asked one evening, catching sight of the raw skin, and the way Kathleen flexed her fingers like they belonged to someone else. Kathleen told her. The widow made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh. Dugouts are what desperate men build, she said, not girls who ought to be finding a family. That was the first disapproval Kathleen heard out loud. It wouldn't be the last. The lumberyard man Hauptmann had come from Prussia with straight-backed opinions about proper construction. When Kathleen walked into his yard asking for sixpenny nails and advice on wood that could survive being used near earth, he stared at her like he was trying to decide whether she was brave or just not right in the head. You can't live in dirt, he said flatly. Moisture will rot everything, walls will slump, roof will collapse. It'll be dark and it'll stink, and by spring you'll be sleeping in mud. He sold her the nails anyway. People will take your money even while they predict your failure. A farmer named Frank Cordell rode by while she was cutting into the bank, and he didn't even get off the horse. He looked down at the growing hole and spoke like an older man speaking to someone he expects to ignore him. You know we get 40 below out here, he said. Weeks of it. You need double walls and a proper stove. A real house. Kathleen didn't argue. She kept digging. The last skeptic hurt more because he didn't sneer. He worried. Father done caught her after Mass near the end of March. His boots were clean, his hands warm inside gloves. He'd known the family since they arrived, and he spoke carefully as if each sentence might become a sin if it landed wrong. A young woman alone outside town, he said, eyes scanning her face for stubbornness. In an earthen shelter. What happens if you fall ill? What happens when the road disappears under snow for a week? Let me help you find a safer arrangement. Kathleen thanked him. She meant it too. Charity is still kindness, even when you refuse it. Then she went back to the creek and put the shovel back into the frozen ground. Because the thing they didn't see, the thing none of them were imagining, was that Kathleen wasn't building a hole. She was building a system. And systems don't care about opinion, they care about physics. She carved the main room deeper and gave the floor a subtle slope, not enough to notice while you walked, but enough that water would choose one direction if it ever entered. A simple grade about an inch drop per foot down toward the entrance. The same way a good barn floor pushes mess toward a place you can clean. She cut the walls with intention, slightly leaning inward, not perfectly vertical. Earth holds better when you let it rest in its own strength, instead of forcing it to act like lumber. And every night when the light was failing, she tamped the walls, compressed them, until the clay and glacial grit packed hard, almost ringing under the flat of a board. It wasn't fast work. It was the kind of work that looks pointless until it saves your life. Then she added the part no one expected. Along one interior wall, she dug a narrow channel below the floor level, running the length of the room leading to the doorway. Not a big trench, just enough to catch the slow seep of moisture and give it a path out before it became a puddle. Outside the entrance, she cut a shallow ditch to carry runoff away during thaw and heavy rain. Gravity, that was the engine. No pumps, no miracles, just the oldest agreement water has ever made with the world it goes down. By mid-April, the hole had become a room, and the room needed a face. She couldn't afford milled boards for everything, so she gathered creek stones for the lower portion of the front wall, stacking them and binding them with mud reinforced with dry prairie grass fibers that made the clay behave less like powder and more like a web. Above that, she framed with cottonwood poles because cottonwood was what the creek offered. It wasn't perfect wood. It was simply available. She left a space for a door and a small window opening 2 feet square at most. She bought a rejected door from Hauptmann, warped cheap good enough when your standards are survival. For window glass, she traded labor, scrubbed laundry until her knuckles cracked to earn 4 small panes salvaged from a burned building. When she set them in place with clay mortar and sealed the edges with sticky pitch, the window looked like a small miracle. Not because it was beautiful, because it meant daylight would exist in that earthen room. Then came the roof where most dugouts died. People built roofs like they built hopes, quickly, cheaply assuming the weather would be polite. They laid poles through sod and called it done. Then the first heavy rain turned the roof into a sponge, and the sponge into weight, and the weight into collapse. Kathleen treated the roof like a shipwright treats a deckwater as always trying to win. She cut thick cottonwood poles, debarked them, and set them across the opening with consistent spacing tight enough to support load open enough not to trap rot too fast. She treated them with a crude mix of oil and tar, just enough to buy time. Then she added a layer meant to slow water, not stop it entirely because nothing stops it forever, but slow it long enough to let it drain away. Paper, grass, then sod. Old newspapers saved over weeks. Dried prairie grass packed tight. Then 2 layers of sod laid with seams crossing like stitched cloth so cracks wouldn't line up. When she finally stood back, the roof looked like part of the earth again. A hump in the hillside. A lie the landscape told to the wind. She moved in on May 6th. The first night, the dugout smelled like damp clay and new effort. Candlelight made the walls look close, like the ground was leaning in to listen. She lay on the flour sacks and tried to ignore the doubt crawling through her ribs. What if Hopman was right? What if it rotted? What if it caved? What if winter turned it into a grave? Then, before dawn, the temperature outside dropped hard, late frost sharp enough to whiten grass and make puddles go brittle. Kathleen woke up and realized the inside of the dugout hadn't followed the outside down. It wasn't warm, not truly, but it wasn't cruel. It sat in the mid-50s by feel steady, stubbornly moderate. Like the earth was holding yesterday's heat in its chest and refusing to give it up quickly. Kathleen sat up, breath visible in the candle glow, and for the first time since the trunk hit the snow, something in her loosened. Not joy, relief. Because the earth had proven the first principle. Mass holds temperature, wind steals it. And she had put herself where the wind couldn't reach. That's the part everyone forgets. They hear dugout and imagine poverty. Kathleen heard dugout and imagined a thermal battery. But comfort in May is not a victory in Dakota. The real trial doesn't come when the world is kind. It comes when the sky decides it has had enough of you. And the winter of 1878 to 79 was coming slow at first, then like a slammed door. Before we get there, remember what I promised. By the end, there will be numbers, temperatures, and wood consumption that make the skeptics go quiet because numbers don't care who you are. If you're watching from somewhere cold right now, take a second, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are and what the coldest night you've lived through was. Some winters teach lessons you never forget. Kathleen didn't know it yet, but her next problem wouldn't be the dugout itself. It would be the one thing every frontier home depends on. Firewood. And in Dakota, firewood is only valuable if it stays dry. Summer arrived like punishment. By July, the prairie baked under a sun that didn't feel like warmth so much as pressure. The dining hall turned into a kettle grease steam, and bodies moving through a heat that made tempers thin. Twice a week, Mrs. Halterman sent workers home early because the kitchen air felt too heavy to breathe. Kathleen would step out into 90-something heat high enough to make the horizon shimmer and walk the 3 miles back toward Apple Creek with sweat drying into salt on her skin. Then she'd duck into the dugout and feel her body exhale. Inside stayed steady mid-60s, sometimes brushing 70 even when the outside world felt like it could scorch paint. The earth around her didn't care about noon or midnight. It moved slow. It absorbed heat and released it on its own schedule. Other people paid money for comfort. Kathleen had dug hers out with a shovel. She used the months before winter the way a smart person uses daylight before a storm, not for celebrating but for preparing. She traded labor for scraps of lumber, built shelves along the wall, hung hooks from roof poles, made a rope bed to keep herself off the floor and away from damp. She found a used cast iron stove with a crack across the top. Still functional, still dangerous if abused, bought it cheap from a family heading back east and spent an afternoon patching gaps with clay until smoke drew right. Not fancy, not safe by modern standards. But on the frontier, you didn't choose between safe and unsafe. You chose between imperfect and dead. Then October came and the creek tested her first. The rain began around the middle of the month. Hard rain, relentless rain, the kind that turns roads into ruts and ruts into rivers. It didn't drum gently, it hammered. The sod roof took it like a clenched fist. By the second day, the yard behind Hopman's lumber piles was a mire. By the third, Cordell lost part of a storage shed when wind shoved water where it didn't belong. In town, men cursed because their cellars filled and their stove wood grew heavy and sour. Kathleen sat at her small table and listened to the weather do what weather does remind humans they are guests. Apple Creek rose ice-cold brown water pushing at its own banks. Kathleen watched through her small window as the creek went from quiet to swollen, then to angry. It crept closer than she liked within a short sprint of her entrance before it finally stopped climbing. Inside the dugout, she waited for the damp to come, for the smell, for the floor to turn slick. But the water behaved exactly the way she'd designed it to. Moisture that seeped through the back wall slid down into the narrow channel below floor level and traveled toward the doorway. The exterior ditch carried runoff away from the entrance instead of letting it pool and soak in. By the time the rain ended, she'd wiped up less than a cup of water from the main room. The dugout didn't feel like a hole anymore. It felt like a proof. Father Dunn came by after the storm, making rounds the way priests do when they're not sure who will still be alive. His robe hem was wet boots coated in mud. He expected to find trouble. Instead, he found Kathleen hanging laundry between cottonwoods, calm as if the world hadn't tried to drown her a few yards away. He looked past her into the doorway into the dim interior. Saw the stove, saw the shelves, saw the clean floor. He didn't apologize, men of authority rarely do, but he nodded slowly as if recording something he'd deny remembering later. Sounder than I expected, he said. Then he glanced at the sky as if he didn't want to linger too long under a roof he had doubted. Winter will be the real test. Kathleen didn't argue with that, she agreed, because she'd already started measuring winter in her mind. In October and early November, she began cutting firewood. Cottonwood mostly fast to season, quick to burn, not the hottest, but available. Some ash and elm where she could find dead standing timber. She borrowed a crosscut saw, worked the teeth through wood with that steady rhythm that warms your arms without warming the air. She hauled sections back on a sled she'd repaired with wire and stubbornness. By early November, she had a respectable pile stacked near the entrance about 6 feet high, 8 feet across. It looked like security. Then the first snow taught her the difference between having wood and having usable wood. The first real dusting came mid-November. Not deep, 2 inches maybe. The kind that melts by afternoon but soaks everything it touches. Kathleen had found an old canvas tarp near the rail line, half torn stiff with age. She'd thrown it over the woodpile like a blanket over a sick child and told herself it was good enough. Snow melted, water ran, canvas wicked. That evening, when she lifted the tarp and reached for a split log, the outer layer was wet and already starting to crust with ice. It would burn sure, but wet wood smokes. Wet wood steals heat just to boil its own water, before it gives you anything back. The stove has to work harder, the chimney gets dirtier, and the room fills with that sour sting that makes you cough. Kathleen brought a few wet pieces inside and leaned them near the stove to dry. And immediately she saw the trap. If she dried today's wood by the stove, she was always burning yesterday's damp. Always behind. Always paying extra fuel just to make fuel. In a Dakota winter, that difference is the difference between waking up with warm fingers and waking up with pain. She tried to solve it the simple way first because simple is what you can afford. She reorganized the pile, split smaller, stacked tighter, tried to keep more covered. But she didn't have enough canvas, and Hopman sold new tarps for more than she could justify. Cordell suggested stacking the wood indoors, but inside the dugout, every cubic foot mattered, and storing a full winter's fuel. In your living space is an invitation to bugs, mess, and fire risk. By late November, Kathleen sat at her table listening to wind scratch at the sod roof and stared at her drainage channel, the same channel that had saved her during October's rain. A long, narrow trench below floor level, 8 inches wide, 10 inches deep, running almost the full length of the room. In winter, that channel was mostly idle. And then, like a quiet click in the mind, the answer arrived. Not a new idea, just a new use. If she covered the channel with boards tight-fitted, sealed at the edges, she'd have a hidden storage space along the wall. A place where wood could sit protected from snow and rain. A place that stayed above freezing because it was inside the thermal envelope of the earth. A place accessible without stepping into a blizzard. She didn't smile when she realized it. She just exhaled and reached for her father's hammer. The next day, she went to Hopman and bought a few lengths of pine board, cheap thin, the kind you'd use for crates. She asked him to rip them down into narrower strips. He raised his eyebrows. "What are you building now?" he asked, voice carrying that familiar tone amusement dressed as concern. Kathleen didn't explain. Not because she was hiding, because she'd learned that explanations are expensive. That night, she cut the boards into sections 2 feet long each so she could lift them like lids. She fitted them over the channel, pressed them into place, then sealed the seams where wood met earth with the same clay and grass mortar that had held her front wall. When she was done, the channel disappeared under a new floor strip along the wall. She stacked split wood inside the covered trench like a drawer full of fuel. Then she did the thing that made it more than storage. She carved a small opening near the back corner close to where the stove's warmth gathered. Not an open hole, just a controlled gap that let a slow current of warm air drift into the covered channel. Warm air moved through the stacked wood, drying it further, then rose back into the room. It wasn't a fan. It wasn't a machine. It was convection harnessed quietly. Block the wind, hold the heat, keep the fuel dry, reduce the effort. That night, the first proper cold snapped down. Not the worst yet, but cold enough that the window edges iced and the world outside went brittle. Kathleen woke before dawn and reached down into her new covered trench. The wood felt dry, not mostly dry, dry. She lit the stove with one match and watched flame take cleanly instead of struggling through steam. No thick smoke, no sour choke, just quick heat. She sat back and listened to the stove tick as it warmed. Outside wind ran its fingers along the sod roof like it was testing for weakness. Kathleen didn't look afraid, because now she had the one thing winter respects, a steady supply of dry fire, and that was before the real cold arrived. Because late December of 1878, the sky would come down like a verdict. Temperatures that stayed below zero day after day. Wind that made the prairie sound like it was singing through bone. When that happened, the town would learn what prepared really means. And they would learn it by watching the girl they threw out. The deep freeze arrived before Christmas the way bad news often does, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. A morning came when the dining hall door handle burned skin. When the air inside your nostrils froze and every breath felt like inhaling needles. Kathleen stepped outside and heard trees cracking in the distance, sharp pops like gunshots as sap tightened under ice. In town, people began speaking in numbers instead of complaints. 18 below, someone said at the counter. 22 below out by the river, wind's making it worse. When the cold becomes the main subject, it's because it's winning. By December 22nd, the temperature sank into the teens below zero and didn't climb back up. Not for a day, not for a week, for nearly 2. This is the kind of cold that punishes habits. The kind that turns a small mistake into an emergency because you don't get second chances when the air itself is trying to steal your heat. Mrs. Halterman closed the dining hall for a week. Not because business was slow, but because they couldn't keep the building warm enough to work without people going numb. The big frame structure bled heat through every seam, wind stripping warmth away faster than any stove could replace it. Families in town did what families always do when something bigger than them arrives. They burned more wood, more coal if they had it, more fence posts. Sometimes furniture, anything that could become heat. And in the first few days of the deep freeze, something else happened. Wood that had seemed fine in November began to betray people in December. Wet wood smoked. Wet wood cooled the firebox. Wet wood coated chimneys with sticky soot that narrowed draft. You'd hear it in the way stoves struggled, huffing instead of pulling, coughing smoke back into rooms. People started waking up tired and irritable eyes, stinging throats raw. Not from sickness, from living in air that was half burned. Kathleen watched all of this the way a person watches a storm from inside a well-built shelter. Sympathy, yes, but also a quiet confirmation. Her dugout didn't need to fight the cold from scratch. It started from a warmer baseline. 8 feet into the earth soil doesn't follow the sky's tantrums. Even in Dakota, that depth hovers around a steady temperature, cool but not lethal. The dugout walls weren't cold air, they were mass, thermal storage, a slow-moving reservoir. So Kathleen didn't have to keep the room hot all day. She just had to lift it gently, then let the earth do what earth does hold. She fired the stove in the morning until the room reached the high 60s, comfortable enough that fingers worked and breath didn't fog. Then she let the fire settle. Coals, a slow burn, a small flame in the evening to top it back up. Not all day roaring heat, not panic. And because her wood stayed dry in the covered trench, each log gave the heat it was supposed to give. No wasted energy boiling off water, no thick smoke. The stove ran cleaner. The flue drew better. If you want the principle in plain words, it's this. Wind steals heat fastest. She had earth shielding her from wind stripping. Mass smooths temperature swings. She had tons of earth acting as insulation and thermal buffer. Dry fuel burns hotter and cleaner. She had a protected wood cache that stayed usable. Smaller heated volume needs less fuel. Her space was modest, no extra rooms to warm just for pride. When you stack those advantages, the result isn't magic. It's arithmetic. But arithmetic can look like magic to people who never did the math. In the first week of January, Frank Cordell's eldest son came into town with cheeks chapped raw and a look that said he hadn't slept. They'd run through their best wood faster than expected. Cordell's frame house was larger, draftier, and sat exposed to wind like a ship at sea. They were burning more just to stay even. And Cordell wasn't the only one. A family 2 streets over started tearing slats off an old shed to feed their stove. Another burned greenwood, cut fresh heavy with moisture because they'd misjudged their supply in autumn. Greenwood burns with anger, lots of smoke, little heat, and it makes you work for every degree. Kathleen's hours at the dining hall dropped business, thin meals fewer. That meant her pay shrank right when winter expenses grew. Flour, beans, lamp oil. You don't starve quickly, but you do starve predictably. And that's when Kathleen made a decision that would change how the town spoke her name. Not a dramatic decision, a practical one. She looked at her wood trench, looked at the stack still sitting dry and ready. Then she built a small sled load, about a week's worth of split cottonwood, an ash bone-dry light, and the hands clean to the touch. On January 18th, with the temperature around 12 below, she dragged that sled toward Cordell's place. The snow squeaked under her boots. Dry snow makes that sound high and brittle. Wind cut across open ground and tried to pry tears from her eyes. When Cordell saw her coming, he stepped onto his porch with the same wary expression he'd worn when he first watched her dig. The expression of a man who expects foolishness to keep repeating itself. Kathleen didn't lecture. She just pulled the tarp back and let him see the wood. Cordell's eyes went to it the way a starving man's eyes go to bread. "You selling?" he asked. Kathleen shook her head. "Trading." He paused. The pause was pride-wrestling need. Then he nodded once and went inside. Came back with food, smoked ham, cornmeal, preserved beans, oats. More than Kathleen could have bought with 2 weeks of wages. Because in a Dakota winter, dry firewood is not wood. It's time. It's sleep. It's not coughing all night. It's a child's fingers staying warm. It's a stove that doesn't suffocate you with smoke. Word spread the way it always spreads in small places, not through announcements, but through needs. By early February, Kathleen was trading dry wood to several families, never gouging, never pretending she was a merchant. Fair exchanges, honest ones, but always profitable because what she offered was unusually valuable. And the strangest part? She wasn't hauling this wood from a covered shed like a wealthy farmer. She was pulling it from inside her own dugout, out of that narrow trench along the wall that her skeptics had called a foolish girl's grave. She didn't go outside to fetch fuel in storms. She didn't crack ice off logs. She didn't bring wet wood inside to dry. She lifted a board, reached down, and pulled out dry fire. One evening, as the cold held steady, Hopman himself showed up at her entrance. He didn't come with laughter this time. He came with his hat in his hands, shoulders hunched, face pinched from sleepless nights. He stood there looking past her at the tidy interior, the stove burning clean, the boards along the wall hiding her wood cache. How he asked as if the question tasted strange. Kathleen gestured toward the wall and the floor. "I stopped fighting what the ground wanted to do. I gave water a path. I gave heat a place to stay. And I kept the fuel dry." Hopman stared at the covered trench like he was seeing a tool he'd somehow missed his whole life. "Can you deliver?" he asked after a long moment. Kathleen didn't grin. She didn't preen. She just named a trade hardware and nails worth $1 for 3 days' worth of wood deliveries. Hopman agreed too quickly, the way a man agrees when he realizes pride is expensive. That would have been enough for most people being right surviving trading. But Hopman's mind was already moving to the next problem merchants in Bismarck had been quietly losing money to for years. Storage, seed grain, apples, potatoes. Anything that couldn't tolerate freeze-thaw cycles in a drafty frame shed. Goods that spoiled, froze, or rotted because the buildings people called proper were actually terrible at holding stable temperature. Hopman looked at Kathleen and said carefully, "What you built. It isn't just a shelter. It was the first time someone said it out loud. And it was true. The dugout wasn't just keeping her alive. It was demonstrating a method, a technique that could spread. But before it spread, before anyone built copies, before any proof became a pattern, winter still had one more move to make. Because deep cold is one kind of test. The other kind is snow and wind so heavy they cut you off from town, turn roads into blank pages, and force your shelter to stand alone. The storm that came next wasn't a lesson. It was a trial. And Kathleen's numbers, the ones that would make skeptics go silent, would come from those days. The blizzard arrived the way a door slams in the dark. At first, it was only wind, steady rising, the kind that makes the cottonwoods moan. Then snow began to fly sideways, not falling so much as being thrown. The sky turned the color of pewter. The horizon vanished. Familiar landmarks blurred into white nothing. By the first night, town was gone. Not physically gone, but unreachable. Roads disappeared under drift. A man could walk 30 steps and lose his sense of direction. Sound muffled. Distance lied. The world became a small circle around you, and everything beyond it was threat. Kathleen stood inside her dugout and listened. The sod roof didn't rattle like a frame house roof. It didn't sing under wind. It absorbed the sound. Wind hit it and slid off. Snow piled on top and stayed, adding another layer of insulation. But the storm found the weaknesses it could. It pushed snow into the entrance ditch. It tried to pack drifts against her doorway like hands trying to pin it shut. When Kathleen cracked the door, the wind snapped it back and threw icy grains into her face. She closed it, leaned her shoulder against it, and thought like a builder. Not panic, planning. She used the shovel to clear the drift line at the door in short bursts, open, cut, close. Open, cut, close. She didn't stand outside long enough for the storm to steal her heat. Inside, the stove burned steady. And that's when the covered wood trench became more than convenience. It became freedom. Because the storm's cruelest trick isn't cold. It's forcing you to spend energy. Every trip outside costs you heat, time, and strength. You lose warmth through your coat seams. You lose moisture through breath. You lose judgment through fatigue. And if you have to keep going out for wetwood, you eventually start making mistakes. Kathleen didn't go out for fuel. She lifted a board, reached down, pulled dry splits, closed the lid. The room never opened itself to the storm. That alone saved her effort. But there was another quiet effect. The little opening she'd carved so stove warmth could drift into the trench kept the wood from turning brittle cold. It stayed ready dry and workable, not frozen into an icy bundle, not coated with snow melt. It's a small thing until you've tried to light a stove with cold-soaked damp wood while your fingers don't want to bend. The blizzard lasted days. Wind raked the hillside. Snow drifted until the entrance path became a wall. The world outside her window turned white and featureless, and sometimes she couldn't tell whether it was day or night except by the quality of the gray. And in town, people began to suffer. Frame houses leaked wind. Doors iced shut. Chimneys struggled when snow and soot narrowed draft. Families burned extra fuel because wind stripping pulled warmth away faster than their stoves could provide it. When you're cold, you burn more. When you burn more, you run low faster. And when you run low, you start burning the wrong things. Kathleen learned about town's trouble only when the storm eased enough for someone to reach her. It was Father Dunn. He arrived with his scarf pulled high eyelashes rhymed with frost. He looked smaller out there in the white, a dark moving dot against a landscape that wanted to erase him. When he knocked, Kathleen opened the door just enough to pull him inside. He stepped in and stopped. Not because it was luxurious, it wasn't. Earthen walls, small window, modest table, stove. He stopped because it was warm, not barely survivable. Warm enough that his shoulders dropped without permission. He stared at her stove, then at the boards along the wall. "You've been alone out here," he asked. Kathleen nodded. Father Dunn didn't know what to do with that. His mind wanted to fit her into his old categories girl, vulnerable, foolish project. But the warmth around him disagreed. He came for a reason. "A family near the river? The children are coughing," he said. "Their wood is wet, the chimney's choking. They're burning through fuel faster than they can dry it." Kathleen listened. The words were plain, but she could hear the deeper message. This is what winter does. It punishes weak systems. She didn't promise heroics. She didn't say she'd fix the town, but she did what she'd been doing all along. She offered a workable step. "I can spare some dry splits," she said, "and I can show them how to keep tomorrow's wood from soaking today." Father Dunn blinked. "You can spare it." Kathleen lifted one of the trench boards and let him see inside. Dry wood stacked like a hidden pantry. The priest stared as if she'd opened a chest of coins. That day, when the wind eased enough, Kathleen loaded a small sled and followed Father Dunn back toward town, moving carefully. Not because she feared the cold, but because she respected it. They delivered dry wood. Just enough to relight cleanly and get the stove drafting right. The difference was immediate: less smoke, more heat, calmer breathing. The kind of relief you can see in shoulders and eyes. The adults asked where she'd kept it dry. Kathleen didn't give a speech. She pointed to principles. "Fuel has to be protected," she said. "If you can't protect the whole pile, protect your next 2 days. Keep it off the ground. Cover the top, leave the sides breathing. And if you have a warm space near the stove, use it as a drying rack, careful with fire distance." Then someone asked the question that people always ask when they see something work. Is your place really that much better? Here's where Wild Ward stories live, the place where opinions die and numbers take over. Kathleen had been keeping notes. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, because she needed to know what was real. She'd marked outside temperatures when she could using the town's posted readings and her own simple thermometer when she eventually bought one. She'd tracked how much wood she burned, how many armloads, how many stove loads per day. She'd learned the weight difference between dry and damp splits in her hands. And after the blizzard, after the deep freeze had spent weeks trying to humiliate everyone equally, she finally had the comparison people couldn't dismiss. Because she wasn't claiming comfort based on feelings. She had counts. She had days. She had cold. And she had a control group, everyone else. Father Dunn, to his credit, understood the power of independent witnesses. He asked 2 men, both skeptical, both practical, to come with him and see the dugout for themselves. One was Frank Cordell, pride still clinging to his coat like frost. The other was Hopman, whose whole business depended on wood behaving predictably. They arrived one afternoon when the outside air was still below zero. Kathleen didn't stage anything. She didn't make the stove roar for show. She just opened the door and let them step inside. Cordell's face changed first. The tension in his jaw loosened. Hopman walked to the wall, felt it with his palm. Not because he thought it was magic, because he was trying to understand the mechanism. Father Dunn watched them both, and Kathleen watched Father Dunn. Nobody spoke for a moment, just the stove ticking. The wind muffled outside, the soft, steady silence of Earth doing its job. Then Kathleen set a simple thermometer on the table and another just outside the door, shielded from direct wind as best as one can on the prairie. And she said, "We'll leave them long enough to be honest. Those numbers outside versus inside would be the first hammer blow." But the real make-them-silent number wasn't temperature. It was fuel. Because every man in Dakota understands wood. They may argue about politics and morals, but they all understand the cost of feeding a stove through winter. Kathleen had been tracking it. And when she finally spoke the figure, it would change how Hopman looked at building forever. They waited long enough that the thermometer stopped chasing and settled into truth. Outside, the air sat in the negative single digits colder when gusts tore through. Inside, the dugout held steady in the mid to high 60s with a modest stove burn. Cordell stared at the inside reading like it had insulted him. Hopman didn't stare. He started calculating without moving his lips the way a lumberman does when he sees waste. Father Dunn cleared his throat and asked the question everyone was thinking. But no one wanted to ask first. How much fuel? Kathleen didn't answer with pride. She answered with records. She pulled out a small notebook, cheap paper smudged corners written in a tight hand. On it, dates, outside temps when available, notes about storms and her wood usage. She wasn't measuring in cords the way a wealthy farmer might. She was measuring the way a working person measures, by routine and volume. 1 full stove load in the morning, she said, and 1 in the evening. On the coldest stretch, I added a small midday feed. But not every day. Cordell frowned. That's it. Kathleen nodded. Then she gave the number that mattered most because it wasn't an estimate, it was a count. In the 11-day stretch when the town stayed below zero, she said I burned roughly half what a similar-sized frame room would need to stay comfortable. Hopman's eyes lifted, half compared to what? Kathleen pointed at Cordell calmly. Compared to him, same cold. Similar stove, different envelope. Cordell's face tightened, but he didn't deny it. Because he couldn't. He'd been hauling armloads daily, waking at night to feed the fire-cursing drafts he couldn't find. His wife had been sleeping in layers. His children had been coughing when smoke backed into the room on bad draws. Kathleen, 16 alone, had been sleeping with a steady stove and dry fuel she could reach without stepping outside. Numbers don't flatter, they expose. Father Dunn asked to see the wood trench again. Kathleen lifted the boards. The wood beneath was dry even after the blizzard. No ice glaze, no damp outer layer, no moldy stink. Hopman knelt and ran a hand along the trench edge where Kathleen had sealed wood to earth with clay grass mortar. That's the difference, he murmured almost to himself. She kept the fuel dry, and she kept the wind off the walls. Cordell stood and walked to the doorway, looking out at the drifted world. He didn't apologize either, but his voice changed. I thought dugouts were temporary, he said. I thought they were backward. Kathleen looked at him. Temporary is a choice, she said quietly. Failure is also a choice. Cordell exhaled, breath fogging. For the first time since he'd watched her shovel in March, he looked like he was being forced to update his beliefs. The next step wasn't Kathleen preaching her method. The next step was the town doing what towns do when they smell survival. They copied. Not because they admired her, because they needed what worked. A merchant asked Hopman if an earth-sheltered storage space could keep potatoes from freezing and apples from rotting. Another asked Father Dunn whether it was proper to build such a thing. A hired hand asked Kathleen bluntly how deep you had to cut into a bank before the earth stopped following the sky. Kathleen answered with the same principles repeated until they sounded like folk wisdom. Choose a slope that faces south if you can. Keep runoff moving away, not towards you. Angle wall so earth rests in strength. Use layers on the roof so water slows and drains instead of saturating. Protect fuel from snow and ground moisture. Dry wood burns like wealth. Wet wood burns like debt. Hopman approached her with a proposal when the worst cold began to loosen in late February. He wanted a storage dugout behind his yard bigger than hers, built with the same drainage logic. He'd pay for materials. He'd pay wages. And he'd share profit once it started earning. Not charity, business. Kathleen agreed, but on her terms. She insisted on hiring help for excavation because she'd learned something the hard way. Exhaustion is a silent killer in winter, and pride can make you dig your own grave. They broke ground as the snow softened. That spring, while others repaired storm damage and argued about who had suffered more, Kathleen taught men how to cut earth like a structure instead of a hole. How to build a roof that shed water. How to create a dead air buffer with sod and paper. And how to turn a drainage channel into a protected wood drawer that stayed dry all season. And as the first green returned to the creek banks, the story began to move beyond one girl's shelter. It became a technique, a rumor with diagrams, a method that traveled. Before we follow that spread, do one small thing: subscribe if you want more stories like this, and tell us where you're listening from. And if you've ever had a winter where dry firewood felt like a treasure, you already understand why this mattered. Because on the frontier, the land doesn't reward what looks proper. It rewards what stays standing when the sky tries to tear it down. By early summer, Hopman's storage dugout was finished. It wasn't pretty. It didn't need to be. It was earth-sheltered, south-facing, cut deep enough that temperature stayed stable even when the sun punished the surface. The drainage channels ran like veins along the walls, sloping toward a controlled exit. One side held a covered trench, scaled larger than Kathleen's, where Hopman began storing his best lumber away from humidity swings. The air stayed cool, the wood stayed straight, and the losses he used to accept as normal quietly disappeared. Merchants noticed faster than anyone else. A man who lost apples to freeze and rot doesn't care what your building looks like. He cares about percentages. That year, spoilage dropped sharply because stable temperature and controlled moisture is the whole game. Potatoes didn't turn to mush. Seed grain didn't mold. Preserved meat kept its edge longer. Hopman charged a small weekly fee for storage space, and within weeks the dugout was full. Kathleen's cut wasn't huge, a few dollars a month, but compared to dishwashing wages, it was a doubling. And compared to what she'd started with $4 in a trunk, it was something even more important. Leverage. Proof turns into opportunity faster than pity ever will. In August, Father Dunn arrived with a couple from Illinois new settlers with strong backs and soft hands. The husband had been a stoneworker back east, but prairie building was a different language. He knew mortar. He didn't know wind. They'd heard about the girls' dugout that stayed warm on half the wood. They wanted to build something similar before their first winter. Kathleen walked them along a creek and taught them what her father had taught her. Only now her words carried weight because she had lived them. Water has to be told where to go. Wind has to be blocked before it reaches your walls. Heat has to be given mass to stay in. And fuel has to be kept dry, or you're paying twice. She showed them how to read the land with their feet. Where the ground stayed spongy after rain bad. Where runoff naturally carved small channels, good clues. Where the south slope took more light even in autumn. They built. They copied her drainage, they copied her wall angles, they copied her roof layering. They even copied the covered trench, because by now everyone understood the same frontier truth. Dry wood is not a luxury, it's an insurance policy. The couple survived their first winter without panic. Their dugout held. Their stove burned clean. And then they told someone else. By 1881, there were multiple Kathleen-style dugouts scattered around the Bismarck area, some for living, some for storage. The technique traveled through conversations in diners, through sketches on scrap paper, through men trying to swallow pride without choking. Not everyone got it right. Some tried to imitate the shape without understanding the drainage. Some built roofs too thin. Some cut into slopes that wanted to slide. But the good ones, the ones built with the principles, not just the appearance, held. And that is how frontier engineering became folklore, not because people loved stories, but because they loved not freezing. Kathleen eventually filed a homestead claim along Apple Creek, securing legal ownership of land that had once been nobody's. The dugout that had started as a survival move became a permanent tool. A root cellar, a wood drying system, a stable temperature storage room. Even after she later lived in a frame house, the dugout stayed in use because once you've had a system that works, you don't throw it away just because it isn't fashionable. Years later, someone took a photograph. You could see the sod roof grown over grass stitched into it like time was trying to make it disappear back into the hillside. You could see the drainage ditch worn deeper from repeated seasons of doing its job. You could see the small window where Kathleen had watched storms with a calm that came from preparation. Modern engineers would eventually put official language to what she'd done: thermal mass earth coupling, convective loss reduction, moisture management, composite reinforcement. But Kathleen didn't need the vocabulary. She had Winter, and Winter had already certified her design. Educational note: this story is a historical-inspired reconstruction. The physics principles described thermal mass wind-stripping drainage by gravity, and the performance difference between dry and wet firewood are real. Any modern earth-sheltered building or heating system must follow current building codes, fire safety practices, and local laws. This is not engineering or legal advice.